I'm Sarah Mitchell, 29, and the moment my parents received that lease renewal notice with my signature at the bottom, 27 years of being called too emotional and financially irresponsible finally came to a head. The look of absolute shock on my father's face when he realized his unstable daughter now owned the house they'd been proudly renting for 3 years was worth every penny of the $240,000 I'd quietly paid their landlord 6 months earlier. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Growing up in the Mitchell household meant living under a microscope of financial judgment that started when I was barely old enough to understand what money meant. My parents, Robert and Linda Mitchell, had built their entire identity around being practical and sensible with money, which apparently meant that anyone who showed even a hint of emotional decision-making was automatically disqualified from handling anything more complex than grocery shopping. And according to them, I was the poster child for emotional financial disasters waiting to happen. The foundation of their judgment was laid when I was 16 and spent my entire summer job savings on art supplies instead of putting it in a savings account like they'd instructed. I'd discovered oil painting and became completely obsessed, spending every free moment creating landscapes and portraits that filled our garage. To me, it was an investment in my passion and potential future career. To them, it was proof that I couldn't be trusted with money because I'd let my emotions override practical thinking. Sarah always acts with her heart instead of her head became my mother's favorite phrase whenever money came up in conversation. She'd say it with this knowing look, as if she'd uncovered some fundamental flaw in my character that explained everything wrong with my approach to life. My father would nod along, adding his own commentary about how successful people make decisions based on logic and planning, not feelings and impulses. This dynamic followed me through college, where they refused to co-sign any student loans because they were convinced I'd make poor choices and default on payments. They were willing to pay for my education directly, but only if I majored in something practical, like accounting or business administration. When I chose graphic design instead, they cut off financial support entirely, forcing me to work 3 part-time jobs while carrying a full course load. Even when I graduated with honors and landed a good job at a marketing firm, they attributed my success to luck rather than skill or determination. The real breaking point came when my grandmother passed away 2 years ago. Grandma Rose had always been my biggest supporter, the one person in the family who understood my creative side and encouraged my dreams. She'd helped me through college financially when my parents wouldn't, sending me small checks with notes that said things like, "Follow your heart, sweetheart, and don't let them dim your light." When she died, I was devastated, not just because I'd lost the person who believed in me most, but because her death marked the end of having anyone in my family who saw my potential instead of my perceived flaws. The reading of her will revealed that she'd left each of her grandchildren a substantial inheritance, $50,000 each. However, she'd also left specific instructions about how the money should be distributed. My cousins received their full amounts immediately. My brother David, who worked in finance and had always been the responsible one, got his money with no strings attached. But my inheritance came with conditions that felt like a slap in the face. Grandma Rose, influenced by years of my parents' concerns about my financial judgment, had specified that my $50,000 would be held in trust until I turned 35, with my parents serving as trustees. The will stated that the money could only be released early if I could demonstrate financial stability and mature decision-making to their satisfaction. Reading those words felt like having my grandmother's voice echo my parents' doubts about my character, even from beyond the grave. The trust arrangement meant that my parents had complete control over whether I could access my own inheritance. They set up meetings every 6 months where I had to present my financial records, budget plans, and justify any purchases over $500. These sessions felt more like court hearings than family discussions, with my parents scrutinizing every aspect of my spending and finding reasons to question my choices. During one particularly humiliating meeting, my mother pulled out a spreadsheet she'd created tracking my monthly expenses. She'd somehow obtained access to my bank statements and had categorized every transaction, highlighting what she considered unnecessary or emotional purchases. The $15 I'd spent on flowers for my apartment was labeled as frivolous decorating. The $40 for a massage after a particularly stressful week at work was marked as luxury spending. Even the $25 I'd donated to an animal shelter was questioned as emotional giving without strategic planning. "This is exactly what we were worried about," my father said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the spreadsheet. "You're spending money on feelings instead of building wealth. How can we trust you with a large inheritance when you can't even stick to a basic budget?" The irony was that I was actually saving more money each month than most people my age, but because I occasionally bought something that brought me joy rather than purely practical items, I was labeled as financially irresponsible. The meetings became a source of constant stress and anxiety. I found myself second-guessing every purchase, wondering how my parents would interpret it and whether it would be used as evidence against my financial maturity. I stopped buying coffee from my favorite local shop because my mother had commented that brewing at home was more economical. I canceled my gym membership and started running outside instead because my father questioned whether the monthly fee was justified. I even returned a dress I'd bought for a friend's wedding because I was afraid they'd see it as proof that I prioritized appearance over financial security. This financial surveillance extended beyond just the inheritance meetings. My parents would make comments about my lifestyle choices during family dinners, questioning why I lived in an expensive apartment when I could save money by getting roommates, or why I bought organic groceries when conventional food was cheaper. They seemed to view every aspect of my life through the lens of their belief that I was financially immature, and their constant criticism was wearing down my self-confidence. The situation with my parents' housing added another layer of complexity to our already strained relationship. 3 years ago, they'd moved out of the house where I grew up because my father had retired, and they wanted to downsize. Instead of buying a smaller place, they'd decided to rent a charming 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes from where I lived. They loved everything about the house, from the updated kitchen to the beautiful garden, and they'd developed a close relationship with their landlords, whom they always referred to as family friends. My parents took enormous pride in their rental situation, constantly talking about how smart they were to rent instead of buy at their age. "Why tie up money in property when we can invest it in the stock market?" my father would say whenever the topic came up. "Besides, our landlords are wonderful people. We have such a great relationship with them. It's like having the benefits of home ownership without any of the responsibilities." My mother would nod along, adding that they felt so secure in their rental because their landlords had assured them they could stay as long as they wanted. They'd often lecture me about how I should consider their approach, suggesting that renting gave them more flexibility and freedom than homeownership would provide. "You're so focused on the idea of buying property someday," my mother would say, "but you're not thinking about all the costs and complications that come with it. Look how happy we are as renters. Maybe you should consider that your emotional attachment to homeownership isn't based on practical thinking." These conversations were particularly frustrating because I had been quietly working toward buying my own place for years. Despite their constant criticism of my financial choices, I'd been consistently saving money and building my credit score. I'd researched neighborhoods, talked to mortgage brokers, and even started looking at properties, but I kept these activities to myself because I knew my parents would find ways to criticize my approach or question my readiness. The turning point came during a family barbecue last summer at my parents' rental house. We were sitting on their back patio, and my father was once again praising their landlords and their rental situation. "The Hendersons are such good people," he said, referring to the couple who owned the house. "They've never raised our rent unfairly, and they're always quick to handle any maintenance issues. It's like having the perfect housing arrangement without any of the stress of ownership." My mother chimed in with her usual commentary about my generation's obsession with buying property. "Sarah, you really should think about whether buying a house is the right choice for you. You tend to make decisions based on what feels right rather than what makes financial sense. Renting gives you so much more flexibility, especially since you're still figuring out your career path." The implication that I was still figuring out my career, despite having worked at the same company for 5 years and receiving multiple promotions, stung particularly deeply. As they continued their praise of the rental lifestyle, I found myself wondering about their landlords. My parents had mentioned the Hendersons occasionally over the years, but always in vague terms. They were family friends who lived in another state and had inherited the property from a relative. They'd been so kind to rent it to my parents at a reasonable rate. But, as I listened to my parents talk, I realized I'd never actually met these people or heard specific details about their relationship with my family. Curiosity got the better of me, and after the barbecue, I decided to do some research. I started by looking up the property records for my parents' address online. What I found was interesting. The house was indeed owned by people named Henderson, but the ownership had changed hands several times over the past few years. The current owners, James and Patricia Henderson, had purchased the property only 18 months ago, which meant they weren't the same people who had originally rented to my parents. Further investigation revealed that the Hendersons lived in Arizona and owned several rental properties in different states. They weren't family friends at all, but rather professional real estate investors who had acquired the property as part of a larger portfolio. The close relationship my parents believed they had with their landlords was apparently based on minimal contact and professional property management rather than personal connection. This discovery planted a seed of an idea that would eventually grow into the plan that changed everything. If the Hendersons were professional investors who owned multiple properties, there was a chance they might be interested in selling, especially if the right offer came along. I started researching the local real estate market, looking at comparable sales and trying to determine what the house might be worth. The more I learned about real estate investment and property values, the more feasible my idea became. The house my parents rented was in a desirable neighborhood where property values had been steadily increasing. Based on recent sales of similar homes, I estimated that the house was worth somewhere between $230,000 and $250,000. With my savings, the steady income from my job, and my improved credit score, I might actually be able to afford it. The idea of buying my parents' rental house started as a fantasy born out of frustration with their constant criticism of my financial judgment. I imagined the look on their faces when they realized their emotionally driven daughter had quietly purchased the property they'd been praising as the perfect rental. But as I thought about it more seriously, I realized it could actually be a smart investment opportunity, regardless of the personal satisfaction it might provide. I spent weeks researching everything I could about the property and the surrounding market. I drove through the neighborhood at different times of day, noting things like traffic patterns, nearby amenities, and the condition of other houses. I looked up tax records, utility costs, and neighborhood crime statistics. I even contacted a few local real estate agents to get their opinions on property values and market trends. The more research I did, the more convinced I became that buying the house would be a sound financial decision. The next step was figuring out how to approach the Henderson family about a potential purchase. I couldn't exactly tell them that I wanted to buy the house so I could surprise my parents with the fact that I was their new landlord. Instead, I crafted a straightforward investor pitch, presenting myself as someone who was interested in purchasing rental property in the area and had identified their house as a potential opportunity. I found contact information for James Henderson through property records and business listings, and I sent him a carefully worded email explaining my interest. I emphasized that I was a serious buyer with financing already arranged, and that I was looking for a property that would provide stable rental income. I mentioned that I understood they had excellent tenants in place, and that I would be interested in maintaining the existing rental arrangement. To my surprise, Henderson responded within 2 days. He explained that he and his wife had been considering selling some of their properties to focus on investments closer to their home base in Arizona. The house my parents rented was actually one of the properties they'd been thinking about divesting, but they hadn't listed it yet because they wanted to make sure any sale wouldn't disrupt their current tenants, who had been reliable and problem-free. We arranged a phone call to discuss the details, and I found Henderson to be professional and straightforward. He confirmed that my parents had been model tenants who always paid rent on time and took good care of the property. He also mentioned that they'd recently expressed interest in signing a longer-term lease, which showed their commitment to staying in the house long-term. This information was perfect for my purposes, as it meant my parents wouldn't be planning to move anytime soon. Henderson quoted me a price of $240,000, which was right in the middle of my estimated value range. He explained that he was willing to offer a slight discount from full market value in exchange for a quick, cash-heavy sale that wouldn't require him to deal with real estate agents, staging, or showing the property to multiple buyers. The price seemed fair, and it was within my budget if I used most of my savings for the down payment and financed the rest. The financing process was more complex than I'd anticipated, but my years of careful budgeting and credit building paid off. I qualified for an investment property loan with favorable terms, and my mortgage broker was impressed with my financial documentation and preparation. Having steady employment, minimal debt, and a solid down payment made me an attractive borrower, despite this being my first real estate purchase. While working through the financing details, I had to be extremely careful to keep the entire process secret from my parents. I couldn't let them know what I was planning, both because I wanted it to be a surprise and because I was afraid they might try to interfere or convince the Henderson family not to sell to me. I scheduled all my phone calls with lenders and lawyers during work hours, and I used my office address for any paperwork that needed to be mailed. The most challenging part was the property inspection. Since my parents lived in the house, I couldn't exactly show up with an inspector without raising questions. Henderson and I worked out an arrangement where the inspection would be scheduled during a day when my parents were both out of town visiting my aunt. I told them I might stop by to water their plants, which gave me a reason to have keys and be at the house without seeming suspicious. The inspection went smoothly, revealing that the house was in excellent condition with only minor maintenance issues. My parents had clearly taken good care of the property, which reinforced Henderson's positive comments about them as tenants. The inspector noted that the roof, plumbing, and electrical systems were all in good shape, and there were no major red flags that would affect the property's value or require immediate expensive repairs. Closing on the house required coordination with Henderson's schedule and my work commitments, but we managed to arrange everything for a Friday afternoon in early October. I took a half-day off work, claiming I had a doctor's appointment, and met Henderson and both of our attorneys at the title company's office. The whole process took about 2 hours, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon, I officially owned the house my parents had been renting for 3 years. Walking out of the title company with the keys to my parents' house in my pocket was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. I'd spent months planning and preparing for this moment, but actually holding those keys made everything feel suddenly real. I was now my parents' landlord, and they had no idea their financially irresponsible daughter had just made the largest purchase of her life. The immediate aftermath of the purchase was strange because nothing changed from my parents' perspective. They continued living in the house exactly as they had before, paying rent to what they thought was still the Henderson family. I'd arranged with Henderson to have the rent payments redirected to me through a property management company, so my parents didn't even notice a change in where they sent their monthly check. From their point of view, everything was exactly the same as it had always been. But from my perspective, everything was different. I found myself driving by the house more often, feeling a sense of pride and ownership that I'd never experienced before. I'd researched every aspect of this purchase, saved money for months to make it happen, and successfully navigated a complex real estate transaction entirely on my own. It was proof to myself, if not yet to my parents, that I was capable of making smart financial decisions and handling major responsibilities. The secret was harder to keep than I'd anticipated. During family dinners and phone calls, my parents would make their usual comments about my financial choices or mention something about their house, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from revealing what I'd done. There were several moments when I almost let something slip, particularly when they'd praise their landlords or talk about how secure they felt in their rental situation. I decided to wait until their lease renewal came up before revealing the truth. Their current lease was set to expire at the end of March, which gave me about 6 months to enjoy my secret and plan exactly how I wanted to handle the revelation. I knew that when they found out, it would fundamentally change our relationship and force them to confront their assumptions about my financial capabilities. During those months of waiting, I threw myself into learning everything I could about being a landlord and property owner. I read books about real estate investment, joined online forums for rental property owners, and even took a weekend seminar on property management. I wanted to make sure I was handling everything professionally and responsibly, both for my own financial success and to prove to my parents that I was taking this seriously. I also started paying closer attention to my parents' living situation and any maintenance issues that came up. When they mentioned that the bathroom faucet was dripping, I arranged to have it fixed immediately. When they complained about the old thermostat being difficult to program, I had it replaced with a modern smart thermostat. They were impressed with how responsive and attentive their landlords had become, not knowing that their daughter was the one ensuring their comfort and satisfaction. The inheritance situation continued to be a source of tension during this period. At our December trustee meeting, my parents once again went through my finances with a fine-tooth comb, questioning various expenses and expressing doubts about my readiness to handle my grandmother's money. They were particularly critical of the fact that my savings account balance had decreased significantly, though I obviously couldn't explain that I'd used most of my savings as a down payment on their house. "Sarah, we're concerned about your savings habits," my mother said, reviewing my bank statements with her usual disapproving expression. "6 months ago, you had over $30,000 saved up, and now you're down to less than $8,000. That's exactly the kind of financial instability we've been worried about. What happened to all that money?" I'd prepared for this question, knowing they'd notice the change in my account balance. "I made an investment," I said, which was technically true. "I put most of my savings into something that I believe will provide long-term financial growth." This was as specific as I could be without revealing the nature of the investment, but it was honest about what I'd done with the money. My father shook his head skeptically. "Investment in what? Stocks? Bonds? Please tell me you didn't put all your savings into some risky venture without consulting anyone." His tone suggested he was already convinced I'd made a terrible mistake, regardless of what I might say. "It's a real estate investment," I replied, again sticking to the truth while avoiding specifics. "I did extensive research and worked with financial professionals to make sure it was a sound decision. I'm confident it will provide good returns over time." I could see my parents exchanging glances, clearly communicating their shared skepticism about my judgment. My mother sighed in the way she always did when she felt I'd confirmed her worst fears about my character. "Sarah, real estate can be incredibly risky, especially for someone without experience. Did you at least consult with a real estate professional? Did you have the property properly inspected? Do you understand all the costs involved in property ownership?" Her questions were valid, but her tone suggested she already assumed the answers would prove my incompetence. "Yes, I worked with experienced professionals throughout the process," I said. "I had the property thoroughly inspected, I researched the market extensively, and I made sure I understood all the financial implications before making the decision." Again, this was completely true, but I could see that my parents weren't convinced. The meeting ended with my parents expressing serious concerns about my impulsive real estate investment and questioning whether this was evidence that I wasn't ready for the responsibility of my inheritance. They scheduled an additional meeting for February to reassess the situation in light of what they saw as poor financial judgment. I agreed to the meeting knowing that by February they'd have a very different understanding of my financial capabilities. As winter turned to spring, I began preparing for the lease renewal process. The current lease would expire on March 31st, which meant I needed to send renewal paperwork to my parents by early March. This would be the moment when they discovered that their daughter was now their landlord, and I wanted to handle it in a way that was professional but also made my point about their misjudgment of my abilities. I consulted with a lawyer who specialized in landlord-tenant law to make sure I handled everything correctly. We drafted a lease renewal that was fair and reasonable, maintaining the same rent amount and terms as their previous lease. The only difference would be the name at the bottom of the document and the address where rent payments should be sent. I also prepared a letter to accompany the lease renewal, explaining the situation and my motivations. I wanted to be clear that this wasn't about revenge or punishment, but rather about proving that I was capable of making smart financial decisions despite their constant doubts. I emphasized that I intended for them to continue living in the house as long as they wanted, and that our family relationship was separate from our new landlord-tenant relationship. On March 1st, I mailed the lease renewal documents to my parents' address. I chose to mail them rather than deliver them in person because I wanted them to have time to process the information privately before we had to discuss it face-to-face. I also thought the formality of receiving official paperwork in the mail would emphasize the professional nature of the transaction. I spent the next few days anxiously waiting for their reaction. I knew they checked their mail every afternoon, so by March 3rd, they would have definitely received and opened the envelope. But my phone remained silent, and they didn't respond to the documents or try to contact me. The silence was almost worse than an angry confrontation would have been, because I had no idea what they were thinking or feeling. Finally, on March 5th, my father called me at work. His voice was calm but strained, with an undertone of emotions I couldn't quite identify. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said. "Can you come over to the house tonight after you get off work? Your mother and I have some questions about the paperwork we received." I agreed to come over and spent the rest of the workday trying to prepare myself for what was likely to be a difficult conversation. I'd been planning this moment for months, but now that it was actually happening, I felt nervous about how my parents would react and whether I'd be able to explain my motivations in a way they'd understand. When I arrived at the house that evening, my parents were sitting at their kitchen table with the lease renewal documents spread out in front of them. Both of them looked tired and confused, as if they'd been trying to make sense of what they'd received. My mother's eyes were red, suggesting she'd been crying, and my father looked older somehow, as if the revelation had aged him overnight. "Sit down, Sarah," my father said, gesturing to the chair across from them. "We need to understand what's going on here. These documents say that you're our landlord now. How is that possible?" I took a deep breath and began explaining everything that had happened over the past 6 months. I told them about researching the property, contacting the Henderson family, securing financing, and completing the purchase. I explained that I'd been careful to ensure the transaction was handled professionally and that I'd had no intention of disrupting their living situation. As I talked, I watched their expressions change from confusion to surprise to something that looked almost like hurt. My mother kept shaking her head, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. My father sat in silence, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the timeline or the financial details. "Why didn't you tell us what you were planning?" my mother finally asked. "We're your parents. Don't you think we had a right to know that you were buying the house we live in?" This was the question I'd been expecting, and I'd thought carefully about how to answer it. "I didn't tell you because I knew you'd try to talk me out of it," I said. "For years, you've been telling me that I'm too emotional and impulsive to make good financial decisions. You've questioned every purchase I make and refused to trust me with my own inheritance. I wanted to prove to myself and to you that I'm capable of handling a major financial responsibility." My father looked down at the lease documents, running his fingers over the pages as if he was still trying to process what had happened. "Sarah, this isn't about proving anything. We've been concerned about your financial judgment because we want what's best for you. We don't want to see you make mistakes that could hurt your future." "But that's exactly the problem," I replied, feeling some of my long-suppressed frustration finally bubbling to the surface. "You've been so focused on protecting me from potential mistakes that you've never given me the chance to succeed. You've treated me like I'm financially incompetent, even though I've been steadily building my career and savings for years. This house purchase proves that I can research, plan, and execute a major financial decision successfully." My mother wiped her eyes with a tissue, and I could see that she was struggling with conflicting emotions. "We never meant to make you feel incompetent," she said quietly. "We just wanted to make sure you were being careful with money. Maybe we were too hard on you, but it came from a place of love and concern." The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with all of us trying to work through years of accumulated frustration and misunderstanding. My parents gradually began to acknowledge that their constant criticism of my financial choices had been hurtful and unfair. They admitted that they'd been influenced by old stereotypes about emotional decision-making and had failed to recognize my growth and maturity over the years. For my part, I tried to help them understand how their lack of trust had affected my self-confidence and our relationship. I explained that the house purchase wasn't just about proving them wrong, but about proving to myself that I was capable of handling major responsibilities. I'd spent years second-guessing my own judgment because of their constant criticism, and this success had helped me reclaim confidence in my abilities. By the end of the evening, we'd reached a tentative understanding. My parents signed the lease renewal, officially making me their landlord, but more importantly, we'd begun the process of rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than parental judgment. They promised to reconsider their approach to the inheritance trust, and I committed to being more open about my financial planning and goals. The transition to our new landlord-tenant relationship was surprisingly smooth. I continued to handle all maintenance requests promptly and professionally, and my parents paid their rent on time every month. If anything, the arrangement worked better than their previous situation because I was more responsive to their needs and more invested in maintaining the property's condition. More significantly, the revelation about the house purchase forced my parents to confront their assumptions about my financial capabilities. Over the following months, they began asking for my advice on investment decisions and including me in family financial discussions. The inheritance trust was dissolved 6 months early, with my parents acknowledging that I demonstrated the financial maturity they'd been looking for. The house itself turned out to be an excellent investment, just as I'd hoped. Property values in the neighborhood continued to rise, and the rental income provided steady cash flow that helped me build wealth more quickly than I'd ever managed before. I used the experience as a stepping stone to learn more about real estate investment, and I eventually purchased 2 additional rental properties over the next few years. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized that buying my parents' house was about much more than proving a point or getting revenge for years of criticism. It was about claiming my place as a competent adult who deserved to be trusted with important decisions. It was about breaking free from limiting beliefs that had been imposed on me and discovering what I was truly capable of achieving. The most important outcome wasn't the financial success of the investment, though that was certainly satisfying. It was the transformation of my relationship with my parents from one based on their judgment of my supposed shortcomings to one based on mutual respect and recognition of my capabilities. They finally saw me as the responsible, thoughtful person I'd always been, rather than the emotionally driven child they'd imagined me to be. Today, my parents still live in the house I bought, but our relationship has evolved far beyond the simple landlord-tenant arrangement. They've become some of my biggest supporters, proudly telling friends and family about my real estate investments and financial success. They still offer advice when I ask for it, but they no longer assume that I need their permission or approval for my decisions. The experience taught me that sometimes the most powerful way to change how others see you is to first change how you see yourself. I'd spent years accepting my parents' narrative about my financial capabilities, allowing their doubts to become my own self-doubt. By taking action to prove them wrong, I ended up proving something much more important to myself, that I was capable of achieving things I'd never thought possible. The house stands as a symbol of that transformation, a physical reminder that emotional intelligence and financial intelligence aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, my ability to understand and connect with people, including my parents, was crucial to the success of the entire venture. What they'd seen as emotional weakness was actually one of my greatest strengths, and it took buying their house to make all of us realize that. The story of how I became my parents' landlord isn't really about real estate or money or family drama. It's about the journey from self-doubt to self-confidence, from seeking approval to claiming your own power. It's about the moment when you stop letting other people define your capabilities and start writing your own story of what you can achieve. And sometimes that story begins with a simple lease renewal document bearing your signature at the bottom, transforming everything your family thought they knew about who you are and what you're capable of becoming. The shock on my father's face when he saw my name on that lease was worth every penny of the $240,000 I'd invested, but the confidence I gained from the experience was worth far more than money could ever measure. In the end, my parents were right about one thing: I am emotional when it comes to money. But they were wrong about what that means. Being emotional doesn't make you irresponsible or impulsive. It means you care deeply about the impact of your financial decisions, not just on your bank account, but on your life and the lives of the people you love. It means you understand that money is a tool for creating the life you want, not an end in itself. The house my parents rent from me is more than just an investment property. It's a home where our family learned to see each other differently, where years of misunderstanding finally gave way to mutual respect and appreciation. Every month when they pay rent, we're reminded not of a business transaction, but of the moment when everything changed between us, when their too emotional daughter proved that her heart and her head could work together to create something extraordinary. That's the real value of what I bought, not just a house, but a new understanding of my own worth and capabilities. And that, more than any financial return, made every penny of the investment worthwhile. The ripple effects of that single real estate transaction continued to unfold in ways I never could have anticipated. Within a year of revealing my ownership of their house, my entire extended family had heard the story, and suddenly I found myself fielding phone calls from cousins and aunts asking for investment advice. My Uncle Richard, who had always dismissed my creative career as impractical, called to ask if I thought he should refinance his mortgage. My cousin Jennifer, fresh out of college, wanted guidance on building her credit score and saving for her first home purchase. The shift in family dynamics was both validating and overwhelming. People who had previously treated me as the artistic dreamer of the family were now seeking my financial wisdom. During holiday gatherings, conversations that used to center around my brother David's latest promotion or investment portfolio now included equal time discussing my growing real estate ventures. Market insights. My parents became unexpected champions of my success, sometimes to an almost embarrassing degree. At my cousin's wedding reception, I overheard my mother telling a table full of relatives about how I'd outsmarted everyone by buying their house. She was practically glowing with pride as she described the moment they'd discovered I was their landlord, painting it as evidence of my brilliant strategic thinking rather than acknowledging their role in creating the situation through years of financial criticism. This newfound family recognition came with its own set of challenges. Suddenly, everyone assumed I had unlimited knowledge about all things money-related. When my aunt wanted to know whether she should invest in cryptocurrency, or when my teenage nephew asked about starting a business, they all looked to me for answers. The pressure to live up to this new reputation was intense, especially since I was still learning and making mistakes like any other investor. The success of my first rental property had given me confidence to expand my real estate portfolio, but it also taught me that property ownership came with responsibilities I hadn't fully anticipated. When the water heater in my parents' house failed during a particularly cold February, I had to coordinate emergency repairs while they were visiting my brother in another state. When a pipe burst in the basement of my second rental property, flooding the finished basement and displacing my tenants for 2 weeks, I learned firsthand about insurance claims, emergency contractors, and the financial impact of unexpected vacancies. These challenges forced me to develop skills I'd never needed before. I became fluent in contractor negotiations, learned to read complex insurance policies, and developed systems for tracking maintenance schedules across multiple properties. Each problem taught me something new about the business side of real estate investment, knowledge that I gradually began sharing with other family members who were interested in following a similar path. My relationship with money itself evolved significantly during this period. The constant scrutiny I'd lived under for years had made me anxious about every financial decision, always wondering how others would judge my choices. But owning rental properties required me to think about money differently, as a tool for creating value rather than something to be hoarded or spent cautiously. I learned to evaluate potential purchases based on their ability to generate income or appreciate in value, rather than worrying about whether the expense would be seen as responsible or frivolous. This new perspective influenced decisions beyond real estate. When my company offered me the opportunity to pursue an MBA through their executive education program, I didn't hesitate to accept, even though it meant taking on additional debt. The old me would have worried about what my parents would think of the student loan payments, but the new me understood that education was an investment in my earning potential that would pay dividends for decades. The MBA program itself opened doors I hadn't expected. My classmates included executives from major corporations, successful entrepreneurs, and other real estate investors with much larger portfolios than mine. Being part of this network exposed me to investment opportunities and business strategies that I never would have encountered otherwise. Through study group discussions and networking events, I learned about commercial real estate, business acquisitions, and sophisticated financing structures that made my residential rental properties seem like just the beginning of what was possible. One of my MBA classmates, Maria Santos, became both a close friend and a business partner. She had a background in commercial lending and was looking for investment partners to help her acquire small apartment buildings. Together, we formed an LLC and purchased our first 12-unit building in a neighborhood that was undergoing gentrification. The project required more capital than I could have managed alone, but splitting the investment and responsibilities made it feasible while teaching me about the complexities of commercial property management. Working with Maria showed me how much I'd grown since the early days of agonizing over my parents' approval for every financial decision. We negotiated acquisition terms, managed contractor relationships, and dealt with difficult tenants as equal partners. She never questioned my emotional intelligence or suggested that my feelings made me unfit for business decisions. Instead, she often commented on how my ability to read people and understand their motivations made me particularly effective at tenant relations and vendor negotiations. The commercial property venture was successful enough that we began looking for additional opportunities. Within 2 years, our partnership had expanded to include 3 apartment buildings and a small strip mall. The passive income from these investments allowed me to leave my corporate marketing job and focus on real estate full-time, a decision that would have seemed impossible back when my parents were questioning my ability to manage my own checking account. Going into real estate full-time meant confronting new challenges around self-employment taxes, business insurance, and cash flow management. I had to learn about entity structures, depreciation schedules, and 1031 exchanges. The complexity of managing multiple properties, partnerships, and financing arrangements required organizational skills and attention to detail that I'd developed through years of defending my financial choices to my fond parents. Their rigorous questioning had actually prepared me well for the thorough record-keeping and analysis required for successful real estate investment. My parents' reaction to my career transition was particularly meaningful. Instead of expressing concern about my leaving a stable corporate job, they expressed pride in my entrepreneurial success. My father, who had spent years lecturing me about the importance of steady employment and predictable income, now bragged to his friends about his daughter's real estate empire. My mother, who had once questioned my ability to balance a checkbook, now asked for advice about their own retirement planning. The inheritance situation had long since been resolved, with my grandmother's $50,000 finally released to me without conditions or oversight. By the time I gained access to the money, however, it represented only a small fraction of my total investment capital. I used it to fund my next property purchase, a duplex that I planned to renovate and flip rather than hold as a rental. The irony wasn't lost on me that the money my parents had once withheld out of concern for my financial maturity was now being deployed as part of a sophisticated investment strategy they couldn't have imagined I was capable of developing. The duplex renovation project introduced me to yet another aspect of real estate investment. Working with architects, contractors, and city permitting offices taught me about construction management and project timelines. When the renovation went over budget due to unexpected foundation issues, I had to make quick decisions about financing and scope changes that would have paralyzed me with anxiety in the past. But years of building confidence through successful investments had taught me to trust my judgment and adapt to changing circumstances. The completed duplex sold for nearly twice what I'd paid for it, generating enough profit to fund my next 2 property acquisitions. The success of the flip gave me confidence to take on larger renovation projects, including a historic house that required extensive restoration work. Each project built on the skills and knowledge I'd developed from previous investments, creating a cycle of learning and growth that kept pushing me toward bigger opportunities. By my 35th birthday, I owned or had ownership stakes in 15 properties across 3 different markets. The monthly rental income from these investments exceeded what I'd earned in my highest-paying corporate job, and the appreciation in property values had built substantial equity that I could leverage for future acquisitions. More importantly, I'd developed the knowledge and confidence to evaluate complex investment opportunities and make decisions that aligned with my long-term financial goals. The transformation in my family relationships extended beyond just my parents. My brother David, who had always been held up as the responsible one, began seeking my input on his own investment decisions. When he was considering a job change that came with stock options, he asked me to help him evaluate the equity compensation package. When he and his wife were house hunting, they wanted my opinion on neighborhood selection and negotiation strategies. The dynamic between us shifted from him being the financially savvy older brother to us being peers who could learn from each other's different areas of expertise. My relationship with my parents had evolved into something I'd never expected, a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared interests. We had dinner together regularly, not because of family obligation, but because we enjoyed each other's company. They were among my most enthusiastic supporters, celebrating each new property acquisition and offering to help with renovation projects when I needed extra hands. The house I'd bought from under them had become a symbol not of conflict, but of the moment our relationship had fundamentally changed for the better. The financial success was gratifying, but the personal growth was even more valuable. I'd learned to trust my own judgment, to take calculated risks, and to view setbacks as learning opportunities rather than evidence of incompetence. The skills I'd developed through real estate investment, analytical thinking, project management, relationship building had applications far beyond property ownership. They'd made me more confident in all areas of my life, from personal relationships to career decisions to long-term planning. Looking back on the journey from that first property purchase to where I am today, I'm struck by how much of my success stemmed from the same qualities my parents had once criticized. My emotional intelligence helped me build strong relationships with tenants, contractors, and business partners. My tendency to act on intuition, when combined with thorough research, led me to profitable investments that more conservative investors might have overlooked. My willingness to take risks, which my parents had seen as financial irresponsibility, enabled me to build wealth at a pace that safe, traditional investments never could have achieved. The story of buying my parents' rental house had become something of a legend in our family, told and retold at gatherings as an example of determination, strategic thinking, and the power of proving doubters wrong. But for me, it remained most significant as the moment I stopped letting other people's fears limit my potential and started building the life I truly wanted. The lessons I learned from that experience continue to guide my decisions today. When evaluating new investment opportunities, I still do extensive research and seek advice from knowledgeable experts, but I no longer second-guess my conclusions out of fear that others might disapprove. When faced with challenges or setbacks, I draw on the confidence I built through navigating complex real estate transactions and difficult tenant situations. Most importantly, I've learned that the qualities that make someone too emotional for financial decisions might actually be the same qualities that enable extraordinary financial success. The house where my parents still live serves as a daily reminder of how far we've all come since that revelation 5 years ago. Every month when they write the rent check, we're all reminded of the moment that changed everything, when their supposedly irresponsible daughter proved that emotional intelligence and financial acumen could work together to create something remarkable. It's a reminder that sometimes the people who doubt you most are the ones who need to see your success to understand their own limitations. Today, as I continue building my real estate portfolio and exploring new investment opportunities, I carry with me the lessons learned from that first transformative purchase. I know that financial success isn't just about numbers and calculations. It's about understanding people, building relationships, and having the courage to act on your convictions even when others question your judgment. Most importantly, I know that being called too emotional isn't an insult. It's often a sign that you care deeply enough about your goals to do whatever it takes to achieve them. The monthly rent checks from my parents' house continue to arrive on time, each one a small reminder of the journey that brought us all to this point. But more than the financial return, that property represents the moment I stopped accepting other people's definitions of my capabilities and started writing my own story of success. And that story, I've learned, is just getting started. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing construction bids for a mixed-use development project that Maria and I were considering. It was my father, and his voice carried an excitement I hadn't heard since I was a child. "Sarah, you need to sit down for this," he said. "The city council just approved the zoning change for the entire downtown district. Do you know what this means for your properties?" I did know, but hearing the confirmation still sent a surge of adrenaline through my system. 3 years earlier, I'd purchased 2 rundown buildings in what was then considered a declining downtown area. The properties had been challenging investments, requiring extensive renovations and commanding relatively low rents. But I'd seen potential in the area's proximity to the university and the new medical center being built nearby. More importantly, I'd heard rumors about potential zoning changes that would allow mixed-use development and higher-density construction. The zoning approval meant that my 2 downtown buildings could now be developed into much more valuable commercial and residential combinations. Conservative estimates suggested the properties had tripled in value overnight, but the real opportunity lay in the development potential. With the right partnerships and financing, these properties could become the foundation for a major urban renewal project. My father's call was followed by dozens of others throughout the day. Real estate agents, developers, and investors who had previously dismissed the downtown area were suddenly very interested in discussing opportunities. Local newspapers wanted quotes about the impact of the zoning change on property values. Even the mayor's office called to ask if I'd be interested in participating in a task force on downtown revitalization. The attention was flattering but also overwhelming. Within weeks, I was fielding multiple offers for both properties, some from major development companies with national reputations. The highest offer was for 8 times what I'd originally paid, a return that would have set me up financially for life, even if I never made another investment. But selling felt like giving up just as the real opportunity was beginning. Instead of selling, I decided to explore development possibilities myself. This meant stepping into a completely different league of real estate investment, one that required understanding complex financing structures, environmental regulations, and municipal approval processes. I assembled a team that included architects, engineers, environmental consultants, and lawyers who specialized in commercial development. The learning curve was steep, but each challenge reinforced my confidence in tackling problems I'd never encountered before. The development project became a 2-year odyssey that tested every skill I'd developed as an investor. Securing financing required presenting detailed business plans to banks and private investors, many of whom were initially skeptical about a relatively young investor taking on such an ambitious project. Environmental assessments revealed contamination issues that required expensive remediation before construction could begin. City planning meetings dragged on for months as we navigated neighborhood concerns and design review requirements. Throughout the process, my parents became unlikely allies and supporters. My father, drawing on his decades of experience in corporate project management, helped me develop timeline and budget tracking systems. My mother, with her background in education, assisted with community outreach and neighborhood presentations. Their involvement in the project created a new dimension to our relationship, one where we worked together as partners rather than as parent and child. The downtown development also brought me into contact with city officials, business leaders, and community organizations I'd never interacted with before. Serving on the mayor's Downtown Revitalization Task Force introduced me to the political and social complexities of urban planning. I learned about affordable housing requirements, historic preservation regulations, and the delicate balance between economic development and community preservation. These experiences opened my eyes to investment opportunities beyond traditional real estate. When the city announced plans to redevelop the waterfront area, I formed a consortium with other local investors to bid on marina management contracts. When a struggling local brewery was looking for investors to avoid bankruptcy, I saw an opportunity to combine real estate investment with business ownership by purchasing their building and becoming a partner in the operation. The brewery investment proved particularly rewarding, both financially and personally. The business had been failing primarily due to poor location and limited marketing, problems that my real estate experience had taught me to identify and solve. We relocated the brewery to a building I owned in the newly revitalized downtown district, creating foot traffic and visibility that transformed the business almost immediately. Within 18 months, we had expanded to include a restaurant and event space, creating a destination that anchored one end of the downtown entertainment district. Working with the brewery also satisfied a creative side of me that pure real estate investment had never quite addressed. I found myself involved in everything from menu development to marketing campaigns, drawing on skills I'd developed during my corporate marketing career but applying them in a much more hands-on, entrepreneurial environment. The brewery became a place where I could experiment with business concepts and community engagement strategies that enhanced all of my other investments. The success of the downtown development project attracted attention from investors and developers in other cities who were interested in similar revitalization efforts. I began receiving invitations to speak at real estate investment conferences and urban planning seminars, sharing insights about identifying undervalued properties in transitioning neighborhoods. These speaking engagements led to consulting opportunities with municipalities and private developers who wanted guidance on community-centered development approaches. Consulting work introduced me to markets beyond my local area and investment strategies I'd never considered. A project in a mid-sized college town led to partnerships with student housing developers. Work with the Historic District Preservation Society taught me about tax credit financing and adaptive reuse of older buildings. Each consulting engagement expanded my knowledge and network while generating additional income streams that supported my core real estate investments. The geographic expansion of my investments required developing new systems for remote property management and market analysis. I couldn't personally visit every property or attend every city council meeting, so I had to learn to evaluate opportunities and manage assets from a distance. This challenge forced me to become more systematic about due diligence processes and more sophisticated about using technology for property monitoring and tenant communication. Technology became an increasingly important part of my investment strategy. I implemented property management software that streamlined rent collection, maintenance requests, and financial reporting across all my properties. I used data analytics tools to identify emerging market trends and evaluate potential acquisition targets. I even began experimenting with smart home technology in my rental properties, finding that tenants were willing to pay premium rents for units with automated climate control, security systems, energy management features. The integration of technology with traditional real estate investment opened up entirely new categories of opportunities. When a local startup company was developing property management apps, I became an early investor and beta tester, providing both capital and real-world feedback that helped refine their product. When another company was creating virtual reality tools for property marketing, I partnered with them to develop immersive tours for my commercial properties that allowed prospective tenants to experience spaces before they were fully built out. These technology investments sometimes felt like a return to the creative, forward-thinking approach that had originally drawn me to art and design. I was once again investing in possibilities and potential, rather than just concrete assets and predictable returns. The emotional intelligence that my parents had once seen as a liability proved invaluable for evaluating technology companies and their founders, helping me identify investments that had both financial, potential and alignment with my values. My investment portfolio had evolved into something much more diverse and complex than the residential rental properties I'd started with. I owned commercial buildings, retail spaces, restaurant partnerships, technology companies, and development projects across 4 different states. Managing this complexity required a team of accountants, lawyers, property managers, and administrative assistants who helped coordinate the various aspects of my business operations. Building and managing this team taught me leadership skills I'd never expected to need. I had to learn how to delegate effectively, communicate vision and strategy, and create accountability systems that ensured consistent performance across multiple projects and locations. The process of hiring and training employees, establishing company culture, and developing operational procedures felt like building a completely different kind of business than I'd originally envisioned. The growth of my business also meant taking on greater financial and legal responsibilities. I incorporated multiple LLCs for different aspects of my investments, implemented compliance procedures for securities regulations, and established risk management protocols that protected both my personal assets and my business operations. These administrative requirements were time-consuming but necessary for protecting the wealth I'd built and ensuring sustainable growth for the future. Perhaps most significantly, the success of my investments had created opportunities to give back to my community in ways I'd never imagined possible. I established a scholarship fund at the local community college for students pursuing real estate and business degrees. I sponsored affordable housing initiatives that provided below-market rate apartments for teachers, firefighters, and other essential workers. I supported local arts organizations and historic preservation efforts that enhanced the cultural vitality of the communities where I invested. The philanthropic activities brought my story full circle in some ways, connecting my current success with the creative and community-minded values that had shaped my original conflicts with my parents over financial priorities. I could now afford to support causes I cared about without compromising my financial security, proving that emotional and financial intelligence could work together to create both personal success and positive community impact. My parents had become enthusiastic participants in these philanthropic efforts, volunteering at scholarship award ceremonies and community events sponsored by my foundation. Their pride in my success had evolved beyond simple financial achievement to genuine admiration for the positive impact I was creating in the lives of others. The transformation in their perspective was complete. They now saw my emotional approach to decision-making as a strength that enabled me to identify opportunities and create value that purely analytical investors might miss. The rental house where this entire journey began had become something of a family shrine, a place where we gathered for holidays and celebrations that commemorated not just our relationships, but the moment when everything changed between us. My parents had long since stopped paying rent, as I'd converted their tenancy into a life estate arrangement that guaranteed their ability to live in the house for as long as they wanted, while also providing them with equity participation in the property's continued appreciation. Recent years had brought new challenges and opportunities that tested the skills and confidence I'd built through a decade of real estate investment. Market downturns required careful cash flow management and strategic property positioning. Interest rate changes affected financing costs and property valuations. Economic uncertainty created both risks and opportunities for investors with the knowledge and resources to navigate volatile conditions. Through each challenge, I drew on the lessons learned from that first property purchase and the confidence gained through years of successful investment decisions. The emotional resilience that had sustained me through my parents' early criticism served me well during difficult market conditions. The analytical skills I'd developed through property evaluation and business planning helped me identify opportunities that other investors overlooked during uncertain times. The story of buying my parents' house had become a central part of my personal brand as an investor and speaker. Audiences at conferences and seminars responded strongly to the narrative of overcoming family doubts and building success through determination and strategic thinking. But for me, the story remained most significant as a reminder of the importance of believing in yourself, even when others question your capabilities. Today, as I continue expanding my investment portfolio and exploring new business opportunities, I carry with me the lessons learned from that transformative first purchase. Every property acquisition, every business partnership, every philanthropic initiative builds on the foundation of confidence and competence that began with proving my parents wrong about my financial abilities. The monthly checks may have stopped coming from their house, but the value of what I learned about myself and my potential continues to pay dividends that no financial investment could ever match.